In this nugget, we're going to get you familiar with Windows PowerShell, so we'll start with some version and prerequisite information. What the different versions of PowerShell are, what you have to have installed to get each of them running, and what you might want to have installed to give each of them maximum functionality. Now, Windows PowerShell ships with two different host applications, meaning little applications that PowerShell lives inside, and these hosts are the way that you will interact with PowerShell. And I want to kind of get you set up on each of them. We'll start with the console host, and then we'll talk about the Integrated Script Environment, or ISE. Let's start off with versions and prerequisites. Version 2 of Windows PowerShell is the oldest version that you should have in a production environment. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing out there that has a hard dependency on version 1, except for some very early versions of Exchange Server, like pre-Service Pack versions. So version 2 should be what you have in production at a minimum. It's available as part of the Windows Management Framework, or WMF 2.0, and that is available for Windows XP and later, and for Windows Server 2003 and later. Version 2 shipped for the first time with Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2. In order to install this, you're going to have .NET Framework 2.0 at a minimum, and you'll get the maximum functionality if you have .NET Framework 3.5. Now, keep in mind that different versions of the .NET Framework work a little bit differently. For example, 3.5 is really just 2.0 plus more stuff, but version 4 of the .NET Framework is actually a totally separate thing. So in some cases, you'll have multiple versions of the framework installed side by side. So as you start evaluating what versions you've got and what versions you need, just be aware of that. Version 3 of Windows PowerShell shipped for the first time with Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012. It's part of WMF 3.0, and it's available for Windows 7 and later and Windows Server 2008 and later. There's an important distinction here. Windows Server 2008 is the server equivalent of Windows Vista. Version 3 did not ship for Vista. I suspect Microsoft probably figured no one would notice. So anyway, Windows 7 and later, Server 2008 and later. It does require .NET Framework 4.0. And there's a trick here, though. It requires the full install of 4.0. Now, a lot of folks, especially if you got 4.0 through Windows Update, you got what's called the .NET Framework Client Profile. And it's kind of a trimmed down version of the framework that was designed to save a little bit of space on client computers. Version 3 won't run on it. In fact, if you try to install version 3 and all you have is .NET Framework 4.0 Client Profile, you'll get an error message to the effect of, this update is not applicable to this system. PowerShell is essentially shipped as a hotfix, and that's why the error message says that. So just make sure that you've got the full install of .NET Framework 4.0. Go to Microsoft's download website if you need to, so you can get the full framework installer. Version 4 of Windows PowerShell, part of WMF 4.0, shipped for the first time with Windows 8.1 and Windows Server 2012 R2. It's available for Windows 7 and later, and for Windows Server 2008 R2 and later, and it requires .NET Framework 4.5. Now, 4.5 is a superset of 4.0. So Windows 8.1 and Windows Server 2012 R2 ship with 4.5. Oh, the version numbers. So anyway, 4.5 is what you want to have. Okay, enough words. Let's start working with some software. I'm on my Windows 7 client computer, and I've left this at the default, which is going to have version 2 of PowerShell. Now, since you still have a Start menu over here, you'll find it under All Programs, Accessories, Windows PowerShell. Now, right here, we need to look at a couple of things. I'm on a 64-bit operating system, so I actually get 4 Windows PowerShell host applications. The ones that say x86 over here, you see these that say x86? Those are the 32-bit versions. The ones that say nothing, those are the 64-bit versions. On a 64-bit OS, you typically want to run the 64-bit version of PowerShell, which means you want the one that doesn't say x86. On a 32-bit operating system, you're only going to have the 32-bit versions, and they won't say x86. It'll just say nothing, because you're on a 32-bit OS. So you can kind of think of it this way. The 2 icons that say nothing after them, those are going to run whatever's native to this operating system. If you've got icons that say something like x86, those are for backward compatibility. Now, the only reason you would really need to run the 32-bit versions is if you have a 32-bit add-in or module that you need to work with. and it doesn't come in a 64-bit version. So that's out of the way. Now, once I get one of these up and running, I will typically pin it to the taskbar, which is what I've done here, because I can right-click this and quickly get to a couple of important links. The first of which is Run as Administrator. So this is Windows PowerShell. Now, it is very, 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 very important that every time you run this, you look at the title bar. If the title bar doesn't say Administrator, then you're not Administrator. So you need to close it and potentially right-click and run as Administrator. So in other words, PowerShell is affected by user account control. It just doesn't participate in user account control, meaning if you don't explicitly run it as Administrator, even if you're logged on as Administrator, you won't have administrator privileges. I've also made a note of the fact that the title bar does not say x86. That means I'm running my 64-bit shell, the native one for this version of Windows. And I've also noted that it is the ugliest font in the universe. And I'm not just saying that from an aesthetic perspective. Here's the problem with this default raster font that this console uses. You can't easily tell the difference between those two characters. One of them is a single quote. The other is a grave accent mark or backtick. On a US keyboard, the backtick is usually on the upper left key right underneath the escape key, and the shifted version of it is that little squiggly tilde. So type both of those as you're using the shell, and if you can't tell the difference between a backtick and a single quote, or a double quote looks weird, or you can't tell the difference between these guys, look at that. This is a curly bracket, and that's a parenthesis, and there is not much difference. There's like 1 pixel that's different between those. You really need to be able to clearly and immediately distinguish between those. So what I'm going to do is go to the properties of this console, and I'm going to pick a different font. I'm going to go with one of these TrueType fonts, and I tend to prefer Consolus. You can see a preview down here. Do me a favor. I don't know, maybe you've just got awesome eyesight, but don't set that small of a font because it's going to get really difficult to distinguish between those special characters. I'm going to blow this puppy up to about 18. It should make it easier to read for us. Now, on the Layout tab, this screen buffer is the virtual screen size. The window size is your viewport. So you can see here in this preview how it's kind of falling off the bottom of the window. Hate that. So I'm going to ratchet the height back in until it's on the window. There we go. I'm going to leave the buffer at 3000 because this lets me scroll back in time to see output and commands that I've run. So I'm going to leave that at 3000. I also want to get the width of the window out to the point where it's going to occupy a bit more of the screen. Let's go with like 150 characters. And here's the trick. See in my little preview? I've actually got a horizontal scroll bar going across the bottom, and that's because my screen buffer is bigger than the window size. You do not want that. If I set this to 150 and tab out of the field, see my little horizontal scroll bar went away? The reason you don't want that, let's get this nice and centered, is because there's a lot of PowerShell commands that have their output right aligned by default. And if it's right aligned and you've got this scroll bar, you know what? I'll show you. Before I do that though, I want to point out I can now easily tell the difference between a single quote, a backtick, double quotes, and my curly brackets and my parentheses are a lot easier to see as well. So let's go ahead and get rid of that line. And I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to do what I told you not to do. I'm going to set this for like 180. There's my horizontal scroll bar. You can see it. I've got it over here now, so I can scroll all the way over. So what happens is I'll sit in a class and I've got students who will run something like get date. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Get date, and let's just, and you'll see what all this means later. Select day of week. Oh, well, it didn't do anything. Yeah, it actually did. And if you scroll all the way over, you'll see that the output got over here because some output is right aligned by default. I will have folks bang their head against the monitors for hours trying to figure out why this simple command does not produce any output. And it's because they forgot that they had this horizontal scroll bar. So that's why we go in and we get rid of the horizontal scroll bar. So your two width numbers should be the same, and they should be set so the entire PowerShell console fits on your desktop, on the screen. The buffer height can be huge. Keep the window height so that it fits on your screen. Now, if you want to change your colors, you can. I'm gonna leave this the same. Sometimes when I do presentations and I've got a projector that's maybe getting near the end of its bulb life, I'll set a light colored background and dark colored text. I know some folks like the dark colored background and the bright green because they can't give up on the days of the terminal, and that's fine. I've had folks set a red background with like white text, and I don't know, that just makes me feel like something's burning down all the time. Red is for red alert, like in Star Trek, not for screen color. So anyway, there we go. I can see all my text. I typed that so that you can see what the default error text looks like. There is a way to control those colors. We're not going to play with it right now, but there is a way to do it. All right, so that's the console. Now let's get the ISE up and running. Now, you're going to find on server operating systems that the ISE is not installed by default. If you are running a server with a GUI, meaning you're not running server core, and you have .NET Framework 3.5, then you can install the ISE as a feature of the server operating system. Now keep in mind, this version of PowerShell only requires version 2 of the framework, but the ISE application actually requires 3.5. So here we go. Let's get the ISE going. You will notice that it says administrator in the title bar. This gives me a lot more capability of adjusting. You don't get to really mess around with your font size all that much. There's no options or anything to do that in this version, but they're not bad, and you can make them bigger. So if I do dir, see this little slider down here? In a way that no other application ever before has ever done, this is how you adjust the font size. So I can bring it up to something a little bit more legible like 18. So you start with this 3-pane layout here. This top pane is my script pane. This bottom pane is sort of an interactive command line. So up here, I'm scripting. dir, cd, whatever. Right, I'm not running anything when I hit enter. Down here, when I hit enter, I'm running something, and the output shows up in this output pane. There's a lot of different ways you can lay this thing out. These little buttons here let you do that. I can get a full screen script editor, and once I've done that, this little blue arrow will take me back and forth between full pane script and full or split view between output and command. Let's make the command a little smaller. That way we can see more output. You can also do side by side. If you've got a nice big monitor, I like this because it lets you script over here, lets you get a little command line to test, and it gives you your output. If you want to flip that, if you want the command up at the top, the green arrow will do that. And then this will let you switch back and forth and toggle the script pane on and off. So you can lay this out however you want to, adjust it however you like. And this is what version 2 of PowerShell will do for you. I'm going to close that. I'm going to close this. Keep in mind, version 2 of PowerShell will run all the way back to XP, and it's going to look pretty substantially the same no matter what version you're running version 2 on. Now, we're on Windows 8, as you can tell, and this is going to be PowerShell version 3, which is what natively comes with Windows 8. So, you're not going to find an icon for this very easily. The easiest way to get to PowerShell the first time is to just be here and start typing power, and you'll get Windows PowerShell. You can then launch that. It came up as administrator, so I'm checking the title bar to make sure it says administrator. I like to pin it to the taskbar. So I've already done that actually. Once you've done that, you can get to it easily, run it as administrator, and run the ISE as administrator. You'll notice that this defaults to a nicer font, which is cool. Aside from that, it's really kind of the same deal. There's not a lot different. If we look at the properties here, it's the same basic console application. They've just rigged it to a different font. We've got, our layout. I've got the width set to the same. I've got the height set to a nice big height. The height of the window is going to fit on the screen. I haven't messed with the colors. Really not much different with the console. Now, when you get into the ISE, things have changed. Nice little splash screen now. And the ISE actually has switched to a 2-pane layout. Now, we've got this little command floaty thing off to the side. This is designed to help you find commands, and we're going to play with this later. For now, I'm going to shut it off. You can either exit closed, or you can just hit this little icon. If you do want that thing, but you don't want it taking up space in the main pane here, you can make it float. So that's kind of neat. So we'll just get rid of that. So I start in this full screen console. I no longer have one pane where I'm going to type commands and another pane where I'm going to see their output. The output is all right here. So it's like this console is embedded inside this ISE application, which I actually like a lot better. I can flip over to script pane, and you see here I've got two. I can do them side by side, or I can go to single view, and I'm just toggling back and forth between them that way. Whatever you like to work with is fine with me. Your slider down here has been changed over to a zoom. So you're no longer picking a font size, you are zooming. I'm viewing a font size at 100%, and that's because we now have the ability to customize the theme. So you can see here, my foreground script pane has been set to black, so that's black text, and I've got it set to Lashida console and 9-point. You've got a bunch of different themes that are pre-built in here for different contrast modes, really. Presentation's interesting. I'll turn this on for a sec. It defaults to a font size of 20. Now, if you're doing a presentation, like you've got a screen up that you need to talk to, then a font size of 20 is nice. So let's hit OK. It's huge. And the scroller now scrolls from that point. So it's adjusting from that 20. 100% means 20 point. So now I got to get it back on 100. And my mouse is being picky. Okay, close enough. I'm going to turn this back to the normal. We don't need it to be that big. Let's pick default, dark console light editor. And what that means is we've got the dark, the white on blue console pane, and then the light, so it'll be colors on a white background for the script pane. So again, this ISE has got a lot of new stuff in it. You've got more icons to play with. You can launch the regular console from here with that little button. You can have add-ons that add into here. There's a whole Microsoft website for add-ons. We're going to play with all of this stuff. But for right now, this is what we're going to deal with. I'm just going to kind of leave this layout here. And we'll go close that. No need to save. And we'll close that. So that's version 3. Keep in mind that's available for Windows 7 and later, and for Windows Server 2008 R2 and later, and it natively comes with Windows 8, which you're seeing here, as well as Windows Server 2012. Now again, on the server operating system, you're not going to have the ISE installed by default. That's because Microsoft is moving more and more towards servers that don't have a GUI at all. But if you have a server and it does have the graphical user interface installed, you can certainly add the ISE as a feature if you need to for some reason. Now let's take our first stop onto Windows 8.1 and, drum roll, PowerShell version 4. There's not really much new to cover in the console. In fact, in terms of appearance and basic functionality, the integrated script environment, the ISE, also is pretty much what you're going to have been used to from PowerShell version 3. There's a couple of new capabilities in here in terms of some debugging, which we will come to in the course of time. But basically, PowerShell version 4's user interface is going to be something that you're familiar with, not a lot of major changes. Now, before we go any further, there's one more thing around versions that you do need to kind of have your head wrapped around. So let's say you're starting with PowerShell version 2 or PowerShell version 3 or whatever. Each of those versions of PowerShell comes with a certain number of commands and capabilities. However, the complete domain of what you can do with PowerShell is not limited to what is built into the shell. For example, if you have Exchange 2007, you get a specific set of PowerShell capabilities. If you have Exchange 2010, you get a slightly expanded set of PowerShell capabilities. So the PowerShell capabilities of the product is dependent on the version of the product. And that's the case for the operating system as well. If you start out with Windows 7, you actually get a fairly limited set of PowerShell capabilities above and beyond what comes with PowerShell. If, on the other hand, you're on Windows 2012, you get quite a lot of PowerShell capabilities as part of the operating system. So the total realm of what you can do is actually a combination of these. It's your version of PowerShell plus your version of the operating system, plus whatever other products you have installed. So to kind of take this in a different direction, here's what a lot of folks will find themselves running into. They'll say, okay, look, I'm on Windows 7, which comes with PowerShell version 2. Okay? But I've gone ahead and I've upgraded. So now I have PowerShell version 3. I'm over here in the corner and I'm looking at this copy of Windows 8, which comes with version 3, and it has a certain set of commandlets. Let's make a little bar chart, and let's say it has commandlets that cover all these different pieces of functionality. Well, if I install version 3 on Windows 7, doesn't that bring me up to the same level? And it doesn't. The coverage of version 3 on Windows 7 might only be this much of the tasks that you need to perform, and that's because a lot of this coverage is part of the operating system, not part of PowerShell itself. So while version 3 of PowerShell has more native functionality than version 2, and while installing version 3 on Windows 7 will increase your capabilities, it will not take your capabilities up to version 3 on Windows 8 level, because Windows 8 itself comes with some of those things. In other words, when you buy a new version of the operating system, part of what you're paying for is better manageability. Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012 come with a lot more functionality as part of the OS than previous versions, regardless of what version of PowerShell you're running. Here's another way to look at it. PowerShell, at the end of the day, really is just a tool, not unlike the Microsoft Management Console, or MMC. And we all know that the MMC has been through various versions, version 2, version 3. Now, if you installed a new version of the MMC on an older operating system, you wouldn't expect to suddenly be able to do all sorts of amazing new things. The MMC is just a tool that lets you get to whatever the operating system knows how to do. PowerShell is pretty much the same way. It's just a tool that lets you get to whatever the operating system already knows how to do. And older operating systems, from a manageability perspective at least, they don't know how to do very much. Now, I know there's a lot of companies out there that are standardized on Windows 7, and that's great. But you're not going to have as much functionality as if you were on Windows 8 or Windows 8.1 or any newer version of Windows. So just keep that in mind. It's really the operating system and the products you're managing that give you PowerShell functionality. PowerShell's core comes with a lot of stuff, but it really relies on the underlying operating system to do stuff for you. Okay, well, that hopefully wasn't too painful. We've talked about the different versions of Windows PowerShell as well as the prerequisites that each has. Now, I need to re-emphasize that there is a difference between the version of PowerShell and the version of Windows that it is running on. Just because you have a particular version of PowerShell does not automatically give you all the capability of a particular operating system version. So kind of keep those things separate in your mind, and it'll at least make more sense, if not make you feel better, when you're on an older version that won't do what you want. Now, and hopefully you didn't find this to be too kindergarten, but we did a quick orientation of the console and the ISE applications of all the different versions of PowerShell. The idea here is to really start you down a path where there's going to be fewer gotchas and fewer things to trip over. And I think by really understanding how these host applications work, you can kind of prevent some of the bigger gotchas. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.